I'm currently wrapping up a university course on apocalyptic and dystopic literature, stories in which something very bad happens to a large group of people, sometimes to the entire world. Natural disasters, deadly diseases, alien invasions, zombie outbreaks, these are the kinds of crises on which these stories turn. And I'm teaching this course, 3 sections of it, during a worldwide pandemic. Am I a cruel, sadistic professor to ask already struggling students to wrestle with stories that may remind them of their own difficulties and losses? Would it be more ethical, more loving, to assign them light and sentimental stories with predictably happy endings, so that they can, at least temporarily, escape real-world trauma and stress? I don't believe so. This humanities professor is convinced that the fine arts, literature, painting, dance, sculpture, theater, film, and architecture can help us process what's going on in our lives, particularly when those lives are difficult. And as a man of faith, I hold that much topically and stylistically challenging art offers us the opportunity to descend imaginatively into the sorts of social and spiritual issues that trouble us most, emerging later with helpful insights into our individual and collective situations. I'm Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt, short and messy conversations about the arts. COVID-19 has followed us into 2021, continuing to transform the way we do life in ways that may well stick with us long after the quarantine has ended. It has altered how we educate our youth, the way we practice our professions, and everything from vacation planning to birthday parties. Sadly, the effort to protect one another from this life-threatening disease has accelerated a process of social fragmentation already in motion due to social media and other technologies determined to convince us, wrongly I think, that real connection requires neither proximity nor familiarity. If reliance on video conferencing has skyrocketed out of necessity, so has our fixation on personal handheld screens whenever we step away from work and school, an unnecessary and more detrimental consequence of this global pandemic. Humans don't do life well on our own. We need one another to speak into our individual circumstances, question our ideas, and remind us that the very worst situations and feelings need not drown us in despair. Fortunately, the arts provide a means of working through personal difficulties, offering us a way to look at the most difficult parts of our own and one another's lives without requiring us to overshare or point fingers. And there are ways to do this collaboratively while still protecting public health. When she was only 19 years old, British writer Mary Shelley published Frankenstein, an enduring horror novel born of a friendly ghost story competition that took place one night in Switzerland. For 3 years, the hero of her story, Victor Frankenstein, hides from those he loves in order to create a living creature out of corpses, a creature who ends up destroying the very family Dr. Frankenstein has so long ignored. Shelley's goal was to terrify her reader with an illustration of scientific ambition unbalanced by family and friends. The many stage and film adaptations that have adapted the novel since its initial publication 200 years ago bear witness to her undeniable success. In 1826, 8 years later, Mary Shelley published her third novel, an equally horrifying tale that, for Shelley, hit very close to home. The Last Man is an example of what scholars call a roman à clef, a novel with an autobiographical key. Once you understand the key to the novel, that Shelley places her dearly beloved in this apocalyptic story, you begin to realize what this novel must have cost her to write. You see, everyone dies in this story, something the title makes clear before we've even cracked the book, and which the narrator repeatedly foreshadows as he relates his tale of woe. Now, why would we want to read what must be a very depressing tale, and why on earth would Mary Shelley write it in the first place? In the years that passed between the publication of Frankenstein and The Last Man, Shelley lost her niece and her friend Lord Byron to deadly fevers, her half-sister to suicide, her husband to drowning, one of her own children to dysentery, and another to malaria. Was writing about an unstoppable global pandemic that takes the lives of the narrator's friends and family somehow therapeutic for the grieving author? Is facing remembered suffering head-on really a better life strategy than escapism and distraction? Mary Shelley seems to think so, and underscores her position by repeatedly dramatizing the cost of not opening up about one's troubles. Adrian, a young dreamer inspired by her deceased husband, Percy Bysshe, often wanders off into the woods, quote, his books his only companions. Time alone that does not seem to conquer the depression that often weighs on him. Raymond, an ambitious politician based on the poet Lord Byron, refuses to share his anxiety about running for office with his friends to negative effect. Lionel explains, if Raymond had permitted us to witness his agitation, he would have been more under the guidance of reason, but his struggles for the show of composure acted with such violence on his nerves as to destroy his power of self-command. And so it goes. Lionel and Idris, characters derived from different facets of Mary Shelley's own psyche, both fail to share their troubles with others and suffer more than necessary as a result. When the plague arrives in England, Lionel's fear for the well-being of family and friends turns into a, quote, strange and wild restlessness, the more intolerable because convinced he must conceal it. His wife, Idris, carries a, quote, ceaseless anxiety for her husband and kids, but strives to curb or conceal her fear instead of talking through it, a decision which, quote, undermined the vital principle. Idris's strong constitution falters, and she becomes much more vulnerable to disease. The message is clear. Camouflaging our distress compromises relationship and can undermine our physical and emotional well-being. If only these characters turned more frequently to shared experiences with the arts to help them deal with their issues. Well before the plague appears in the story, the narrator, Lionel, makes it clear that the arts save him from a life of bitterness and degradation. Orphaned at a young age, he had degenerated into a wild and bitter teenager who found pleasure only in the risks his gang took in stealing and killing others' livestock. The son of a long-lost family friend saves Lionel by showing him kindness and introducing him to literature. Adrian draws Lionel into a world of fiction, poetry, and philosophy, lending him books that help Lionel see, quote, the universe not only as it presented itself to my outward senses, but as it had appeared to the wisest among men. These thoughts allow him to converse, imaginatively, with some of the world's most thoughtful minds, provide a shared body of knowledge that draws him into deeper friendship with Adrian. Though his old gang proves uninterested when he tries to share his new learning with them, his sister, Perdita, slowly wakens to the arts. Within months, she has joined Lionel and his new friends in an idyllic 5-year period of camaraderie, which Mary Shelley describes with the rose-colored nostalgic hues of her own recollections of romance and friendship. For these few short years, the newly married Lionel and Perdita, their spouses and Adrian, live a simple life in a rural setting. Their companionship with each other and with nature provides an ideal environment for reveling in the fine arts. These 5 characters spend entire days in the forest, sharing books and music, and many an evening lifting their voices in song. All is well, as long as they combine their artistic efforts and perspectives. But, as noted earlier, Adrian regularly wanders off with books to indulge in dark thoughts. He remains the most emotionally unpredictable of the group, swinging between cheerfulness and a deep despondency too often unmitigated by the influence of others' perspectives. Mary Shelley implies that isolation allows Adrian's imagination to dive down dark rabbit holes, intensifying instead of moderating his sadness. Reading literature in isolation presumably allows Adrian to pick and choose forms of story that function as an echo chamber, magnifying his most intense feelings and unhealthy thoughts. If he instead read sad poetry in community with his friends, the shared experience and subsequent discussion would likely help him work through his emotions. Instead, his solitary reading tendencies mire him deeper in the muck of his own melancholia. In this, Adrian exemplifies an unhealthy autonomy and misuse of the arts, against which other encounters with the arts in the book will be measured. After Raymond devastates Perdita by having a love affair, the arts only benefit her when she engages with art that reflects her own emotional state and brings others into the experience. When Lionel, Idris, and Adrian swing by to visit the unhappy couple, Perdita initially pretends everything is fine by encouraging them to sing light-hearted melodies from Mozart's operas, songs at odds with what she's truly feeling. Instead of opening up to those who know her best, she employs the arts to help her put on a facade. When Raymond moves the group into more emotional music from Mozart's Don Giovanni, however, an opera about a sexually promiscuous nobleman, ironically similar to himself, the dejected Perdita pulls her brother aside and opens up about her suffering. In this instance, heartbreaking music, experienced in the presence of friends and family, catalyzes sharing about a heartbreaking situation. As their marriage continues to founder, Perdita tries again and again to find refuge in the arts, but her solitary ventures provide little comfort. Painting allows her to express, but also obsess over her emotions. With this occupation, Lionel explains, she gave up almost every other, and her mind preyed upon itself almost to madness. In the same way, Perdita's singing expresses but also intensifies her suffering. Her melancholy thoughts, Lionel tells us, renewed themselves in each change of key. Not until Linus convinces Perdita to begin reading the same kinds of literature that enlightened him do the arts begin to heal her. Allowing others' ideas to traipse through her mind helps her question and refine her own reflections. Though she remains understandably angry with Raymond, her heart grows, quote, soft and gentle the more she reads, and she apparently begins to understand her own character much better. Literature-induced self-examination and conversation with her brother help her identify the good and evil within herself, and, for a time, she plots a more even-tempered and prudent course forward. I'll stop sharing character-specific plot details at this point, about a third of the way through the novel, as I'd like to recommend the book to those unfamiliar with it. Suffice it to say that as matters get much worse with the arrival of a deadly plague, the arts continue to play a pivotal role. Watch for those moments when a key character attends a gloomy theatrical performance of Shakespeare's Macbeth without supportive friends in tow. A crowd of college students dances wildly with strangers during a midnight party. A young woman plays the organ in a deserted village for the only other local survivor, her blind father. And a tightly knit group of survivors tells one another stories, visits abandoned art museums, and engages in diverting play acting while traveling across a depopulated countryside. In this frightening tale about mass destruction, Mary Shelley suggests that even in the midst of a crisis, the arts can enrich us in meaningful ways, particularly when encountered and processed together. Art, of course, provides any willing, introspective participant the opportunity for growth, whether encountered corporately or solo. Shelley's novel, however, makes a compelling case for a communal approach to the arts, an argument we would do well to consider in this season dominated by Zoom, social distancing, and pre-recorded teaching videos. Forming an online book club to wrestle with challenging novels, reading aloud and analyzing poems in a socially distanced masks-on circle at the local park, and mixing commentaries from separate households about movies played back synchronously online can help us bring perspective to one another's lives. The participant who sees his depression illustrated in film and who hears others talk about their similar gloom gains potential insight into his own situation and might not feel quite so alone in his suffering. The contributor who hears her own existential dilemma expressed in verse or her relational trauma dramatized in fiction gains not only a new frame of reference, but practical coping skills and new angles of approach once others begin discussing applicable real-world issues as they apply to the fictional character in question. Iron sharpens iron, wrote one author of Proverbs, an aphorism that reminds us that we need one another to change and grow. With the arts providing an arena for intentional interpersonal engagement, perhaps we can curtail that quarantine-induced explosion in mental health problems which psychologists predict is about to overtake us. Some will say this is the worst time to be looking at dystopic and apocalyptic literature. I think it's the best. I'm going to wrap things up by endorsing 3 other thematically challenging titles in this genre, novels to consider if your family, friend group, or book club is looking for something imaginative to help you process COVID-related stress. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, a tale about hostile Martians landing in England, examines the psychological impact of sustained fear when you know that your life could be snatched away at any moment. Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, a novella about vampires that is much darker and intense than any of the 3 movies it has inspired, considers the emotional cost of prolonged isolation. And P.D. James' The Children of Men provides yet another what-if scenario, one grounded in fertility trends already in evidence around the world. What if humanity lost its ability to reproduce and was staring down the barrel of its own imminent demise? That's it for this round. I'll see you next time for more Digging in the Dirt.